Are we ready? All right. Okay. Well, thank you again for coming. It's always interesting and good for me to do this material because I think it has a fresh story that's fresh every generation. Let's start in John 17 this morning. If you'll open your Bible and turn there, that kind of gets us where I would like for us to start. We've covered a lot of material and left a lot of material out. So if you notice on the bottom of page 3, I think it is, Roman numeral 16, I talk about the division that occurred over instrumental music and missionary societies. And I'll say a word about that because we have Brother Moses has brought us some local flavor pictures and things that I want to talk about in a moment. But before all of that, you look at Jesus' prayer in John 17. Some of the last words in the last night of his life. Neither pray I for these alone, but for them also which believe on me through their word, that they may all be one, as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. I can tell you from personal experience, both in small towns and in larger cities, that one of the biggest impediments to preaching the gospel is the division that exists among Christians. People in the world see that and they don't see Christ's prayer exemplified. And so when we talk about the unfinished restoration, part of that is the attempt to answer the Lord's prayer for unity. And this is just as important as Acts 2:38. I think we don't talk about it enough. And so I wanted to start there this morning by just reminding us about Jesus' prayer for unity before we start talking about the division. Now, divisions are sometimes necessary. Jesus himself talked about that. I came not to bring peace, but a sword. So you have to put that text alongside John 17. Mother against daughter-in-law, father against son. All of these things are things Jesus talked about. And sometimes division becomes necessary in order to have the wisdom which is first pure and then peaceable, James says, the brother of the Lord in James chapter 3. So with all that as a kind of a background, I want us to start with another passage. Divisions must occur, Paul says. When you come together, I hear that divisions exist among you, and in part I believe it, for there must also be factions among you. Now, why? Why would that be? That those who are approved may become evident among you. And he says, not Paul, but John, the apostle of love, also says in 1 John 2, they went out from us. You study the pronouns there. There are some who went out as opposed to those who are apostles. The us here are apostles. Go back to chapter 1. What we saw, what our hands handled, what we have learned concerning the apostolic message, but some left it. They're not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have continued with us, but they went out that it might become plain that they are not of us. So what division does, in many ways, is to show who's really interested in following the Lord and who is just talking about it, who's just slinging slogans, if you will. My dad, I said the other day, took me to this debate when I was 5 years old, and I think that's cruel and unusual punishment. But he told me later that one of the things he learned, he was about 32 at the time, as a young man trying to sort through the issues in the institutional controversy that I'm going to talk about a little bit later today. I was asked to talk about that. And he said, after a while, you'd hear guys get up and you say, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And this guy brought some scripture too. And then the other guy comes back with some passages. It's a debate after all. But he said, after a while, I think he went to all 4 nights of the debate. He said, you get a sense for who's actually looking for the truth and who's just making arguments. And I think that's what these texts are talking about here. So you get to the division. I mean, we can talk all about a lot of this. Psalm 44, Psalm 133, how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity. But the fact is that this movement to unite Christians by abandoning denominationalism and trying to go back to the Bible divided 2 or 3 generations out from the Campbell and Stone generation. And divisions have continued about every 3 generations, actually. That's a theme that we'll work on. So I put a kind of a timeline up here just to I tell students history is not really about dates, it's about people. It's about what people did and the circumstances they lived in. But you got to know some dates in order to put a framework on it. So in 1832, the Stone and Campbell people meet together in Lexington on Sunday, January 1st, 1832, and they observed the Lord's Supper, and then what they called extended the right hand of fellowship. They agreed to try to work together. And I had a picture the other day of John T. Johnson, Raccoon John Smith, riding around on horseback to all these churches in these towns where you'd have a congregation that had been reading some of Campbell's writings and another one been reading some of Stone's Christian Messenger. And for the most part, they came together. They united. So instead of having two churches in a town, now you have one. So that happened. But then in 1849, only 17 years later, some of them wanted to start a missionary society, and Alexander Campbell went along with it, and then instrumental music was introduced. First documented reference I know of is in Cincinnati in 1855, which predates Midway by a little bit. So Midway can't any longer make a claim to being the first use of the instrument. The Civil War, of course, comes along. I've got a handout on racial attitudes among churches of Christ that I did actually. Our young people at Danville, I taught a class with one of our deacons in which we looked at some of the issues that our young people, teenagers, young marrieds, college age students are facing. And one of them is, how do you deal with all of the racial conflict that we're experiencing even today? Maybe nothing like what existed 100 years ago or after Reconstruction and so forth, and then into the 20th century, but it's an issue. So I put that together. And since somebody asked me about it and put a question on the board there, I thought we would do that. And we may have time to talk a little bit more about that later, but I got other fish to fry here first, all right? So what you get by 1906 is the federal census. The U.S. government starts taking censuses of religious bodies, different from the one that they do every 10 years. In 1906, 16, 26, and 36, they sent census workers around to query churches and maybe even individuals about their religious beliefs. They didn't do it in 1946 because it had been disrupted by World War II. And then, pretty obviously, it's not really constitutional for a government agency to go knocking on your door and asking you about religion. That's just not something governments probably ought to do. Although, as a historian, I really wish they would do it because it gives you really hard data. It gives you more reliable numbers than anywhere else. Census data is the hardest numbers that we have. But even in 1906, it became obvious to the federal government that there are two different groups here. There are people that were calling themselves Churches of Christ and people that were calling themselves Christian Church. And for the most part, they continued to separate. And then the Christian Church, pro-instrument people, a generation later, they divide into the independent Christian churches, the North American Convention, it's more conservative, and then the Disciples of Christ, which is an ecumenical, ultra-liberal denomination even today. In 1968, they restructured the more liberal wing of it and said, let's not say we're non-denominational. We are denominational. We have all the denominational agencies. We think like a denomination. We act like a denomination. We quack like a denomination. Let's quit saying, let's be honest about it. And so they formally restructured into a denomination so that they could participate in the ecumenical movement. So that just kind of timelines what happens here. Now, another way to look at the timeline is that you get a generation in which the division, the separation from denominations is occurring, roughly 1825 to 1840. This is Alexander and Thomas Campbell, and they're separating, and then they're uniting at Lexington in 1832. And a lot of these churches are leaving the Baptist denomination, saying, we don't want to be Baptist or Presbyterian or Methodist, a lot of that, and we want to be Christian. So you get a generation then that has some relative harmony. That didn't mean they didn't disagree with each other about things, but they're able to worship together and work together. But then about 3 generations out, beginning in the 1880s, let's say, up till 1900, they go through this instrumental music missionary society division that because these issues demand participation, they demand fellowship or joint participation in a congregation. Somebody rolls a piano in, then either you're going to have to sing with the piano or you're going to have to violate the command to sing and not sing, or you're going to have to leave and go somewhere else and create a division, or you're going to have to create enough stink about it that somebody else leaves and causes a division. I don't know any other than those four choices, and they're very unenviable choices. And so the division occurs, and it usually happens about 3 generations out. And there's nothing magical about that, but think about what happens a third generation. By the time you get there, you don't really have anybody that has an adult memory of the last division. I have childhood memories of the division in the 1950s, but they are childhood memories. I've gone back and tried to fill in some blanks, but I didn't really experience that division as an adult. And anybody that's younger than me certainly has no memory of that. And so kind of what happens is we get these generational cycles. So then the division that, say, occurred around 1900 that even the government recognized happened by 1906, you get a generation of relative unity, a kind of a second generation of Christians. And then you get into the third generation in the 1950s and early 60s, and you get this division in which a majority, generally, as with the instrumental music division, most of the churches went with the instrument. Most of the churches divided about 85% if you look at the census data. So only a small minority, about 15% of the churches remained and said, we are not going to use the instrument. We're drawing a line here. This is what, so you get that idea. But most of the churches divided. Most of the churches that had elders were led right off the cliff by their elders, which is why Acts 20 is in the Bible. Paul's warning to those who are elders. It's because the church has elders. Don't misunderstand me. I respect elders. I love elders. My granddad was an elder. My dad was an elder. I've been an elder, a shepherd. It's a hard job. But the historical fact is that most of the churches that went into digression were led by their elders, or maybe their elders had been deceived. I don't know what it is, but that's why Acts chapter 20 is so important. And then you go through the same kind of cycle. The minority kind of consolidates in the institutional division of the 1950s and 60s. Again, although we don't have census data, but if you look at the published lists of, Brethren published lists of sound churches, it's about, again, another 12 to 15% in the minority, follows that kind of a track. Well, where are we today? We are getting into a third generation since that division. There are very few of us left who have any memory of what that was like. And to be very honest about it, I am seeing and hearing all kinds of things that kind of disturb me. Nothing that may be really obvious yet, but because I know how these divisions occurred, because I've studied about it a lot, it just really kind of makes me nervous about where, after I'm not here, what's going to happen to churches that my children and grandchildren are part of. So that's one reason why I do this series, is to kind of give us a sense of warning about that. So I have a childhood memory of the controversy, but anybody younger than me doesn't. I've told you a little bit about all of these other things. I'm going to skip that slide. When I think about my career, if you will, as a historian or studying these things, I've really studied dissenters all the way back to the Campbells and Stone and these others, who left these denominations in their quest to find New Testament Christianity. Now, if you want more resources on this, there's a really good doorstop book called The Encyclopedia of the Stone Campbell Movement. I did a number of the articles there, some of these that you see there, but other people did. It's been translated. I didn't know it had been translated into Korean until a few years ago, which I don't know why anybody in Korea is interested in the American Restoration Movement, but I'm glad they did it so that the word spreads. So we're going to talk about the unfinished restoration with all of these things that we've talked about. But I want to do one thing before I forget to do this. Brother Moses brought me some material here, San Antonio church history. And what we have here is he's got a picture, and they're fragile in some ways. I don't want to pass this around. This is the Church of Christ, which met at 314 6th Street here in San Antonio. His uncle, J. Paul Tisdall, was the minister. Now, it has Church of Christ on it. Here's another picture with, I think this is Brother Moses on the right. Is that correct? All right. So if you want to pass these around, you can do that. This one's dated on the back, January 18th, 1949. I was 4 weeks old at that time. But here's a Church of Christ. It says on the sign, And the bulletin, this is actually from another one that I think his uncle started. This one down in La Villita, is that correct? All right. Okay. This one was dated April 13th, 1947. This is the bulletin. And it says, item number 1 on the next page. Its purpose is to restore the church described in the New Testament in doctrine, polity, church government, name, and life. We are to be Christians only, and it goes through a lot of different texts. So wonderful, using a biblical name, has all of the biblical phrases, and yet I'm told that this is a church that had the name Church of Christ but used instrumental music, which, as I've told you before, if you can find that all over the Midwest. I mean, in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, the North American Christian Convention, which is the undenominational fellowship of Christian churches and Churches of Christ Incorporated. They still use the name Church of Christ. And so here are a couple of other tracks. This one by Pearl Welsheimer, although this belonged to his uncle. Welsheimer was a leader in these independent Christian churches. And so what you have here is something that's calling itself the Church of Christ, wears a biblical name, is, I'm sure, biblical in a lot of different ways. There's another track, Essentials versus Non-Essentials, and talks about what do you have to do and what's not something you have to do. And when he talks about the instrument, guess which category he puts that in? Of something that's non-essential. In other words, you can go ahead and do it or whatever. So I'm going to give these back to you before, I'll just put them here. And if you want to see that, you can come up afterwards. Kent gave me this print off along the same line, actually, a little bit of Texas history. Again, Joseph Addison Clark, who was one of the founders of the old Thorpe Spring Christian College out west of Fort Worth, later develops and moves into Fort Worth and becomes what's now Texas Christian University. But when it met at Thorpe Spring, and actually the old campus is still there. I taught this material in 1982 or 3 at that camp, which was being run at the time as where the Florida College camp was. And interesting story, Joseph Addison Clark is the guy who comes from Kentucky, like a lot of these people did, settles in Texas. And if you've ever heard the Play On Miss Bertha story, the church in Thorpe Spring did not use the instrument, but in the 1870s, somebody decided to introduce the instrument. I think maybe one of the brothers, I think they were divided about this, but they rolled the piano in, and some of the people, including old Brother Clark, who was elderly at the time, got up with a petition and asked them not to use the instrument. And the preacher turned to the piano player and said, "Play on, Miss Bertha." And so some of them left. The church divided there. I got to tell you a story that's kind of related. It's just too good not to tell you. When I taught this material in Thorpe Spring the first time, somebody had told me that Brother Tillett S. Tedley, the hymn writer, a famous member of the church, was buried in Thorpe Spring. And so I went through the cemetery there that week, and I could not find Tedley's grave. So Jamie and Glenna Sloan, Jamie was running the camp at the time. Some of you knew Jamie and Glenna they were at Kleinwood. They were actually at Castleberry before that in Fort Worth. We knew them in Louisville when we were all young marrieds trying to raise kiddos. So Jamie and Glenna, somebody said, no, he's buried up at Gunter, Texas, up toward the Red River. So we were actually scouting a site because the FC camp eventually moved to a different campsite up in Red River territory. Anyway, so we went into to Gunter on a hot Texas day in August. I mean, just high humidity temperature. I don't know, maybe not 115, but it sure felt like it. And we hiked the cemetery and just could not find Brother Tedley's grave. Now, so what I did is there's a home for the aged there that's run, I think, by the No Bible Class brethren. So I go hiking into the desk, and I ask the young lady at the desk, "Can you tell me where Tillett S. Tedley is buried?" And she looked at me like I had lost my mind and says, "Buried? He's in room 106. And indeed he was. He was 99 at the time and blind. I had thought he died, but in fact he lived to about 104. If you remember Willard Scott on the NBC Today show used to do people that are 100 years old, and Brother Tedley was on there for 3 or 4 years before he died. So we went down to room 106 or whatever it was, and Brother Tedley was there, and we talked a while, and he said, get up in that cupboard over there and get some of my hymnals down. He had taken about 90 of his hymns and had them bound in a little booklet, and he said, turn to page 59, I'll sing the tenor. And from memory, he did. He didn't need to read it. So Glenda sang the lead, and Jamie sang the lead. Glenda sang alto. I sang bass. We sat there and sang with Tillit S. Tedley for probably a half an hour. So um, Joel, their son, who died of cancer a few years ago, told me once. He said, when I was growing up, he said that was one of the coolest preacher stories I ever heard. So anyway, there you have it. So again, a little bit of Texas history that integrates into this idea of what we're talking about. But let's look at the nature of the division here, and I may have to do some slide editing here. But this makes the same kind of point, though, of generational divisions. In the 1830s, you have a generation that's wrestling with: are we going to be Baptists or Presbyterians or Methodists, or are we going to be Christians? Are we going to have local, independent, self-governing churches, or are we going to organize like the denominations in a hierarchy and have a missionary society or some human agency that does the work that churches ought to be doing? That goes through a generational process, and 60 years later, in the 1890s roughly, you get another division over worship, over instrumental music, over human societies or churches. The other big issue, anybody know what the other big issue in that division was? It was whether women ought to preach or not. I mean, they went this whole controversy that a lot of people are upstirred about today, about should women have the right to preach. I may have a quotation about that from the papers at the time. And then you get the same kind of 60-year cycle in the 1950s, where the question is, are we going to let churches do the work of the church, or are we going to let colleges and Herald of Truth TV programs and orphanages and whatever do what churches ought to be doing or individual Christians ought to be doing? And then you can do the math for where we are today out from that division in the 1950s and 60s. I'm not saying it's inevitable. I will tell you that the same kind of pattern works generally in the secular culture. I mean, if you look at the major wars that this country has fought, 1781, you get the ending basically of the Revolutionary War. And then in 1861, 80 years later, what do you get? The beginning of the Civil War. And then in 1941, another 80 years, where you don't have anybody with living memory of how bad that was, of what it's like to have in the Civil War. They had what was called the empty chair, a kind of a ceremony that every family did. If they lost a father or a brother or a son or a cousin, they would still set a place at the table, even though they knew he was not going to be there. And they would remember the person who sat in the empty chair. And if you do the statistics on casualties, I mean, the 750,000 dead Americans, that's roughly 2% of the population. If you had a war today that killed 2% of what is it now, 360 million? I mean, do the math. Where would you put the bodies? So every family had somebody in their family, cousin, uncle, brother, son, father, who didn't come back from the war. Or those who came back, usually times 5 or 6, came back severely wounded, by which I mean they lost an arm or a leg. If you were in Civil War, if you were gut shot with a 58 caliber low muzzle velocity bullet, you would not survive that generally. But you might lose an arm or a leg. And so young, strong, virile guys who went away to fight this war came back with their sleeve pinned up or on crutches. And the impact of the war just went on for generations, to say nothing of what became of the slave population. But that's it. My point here is that you get 80 years out from a war and nobody really remembers how bad that is and why you don't really want to do that again. And so we wind up making the same mistake. And I would actually argue that goes all the way back to Judges chapter 2. where you get a generation that arose that did not know Moses. They didn't know what happened. They didn't know, and Moses might well have been Adam as far as they were concerned. They just heard about what happened and so forth. So, what do you get out of this division? Well, you get the Christian church as opposed to, which divides then into the independent Christian churches. The liberal disciples branch of that goes through restructure. Their headquarters is in Indianapolis. The undenominational fellowship, the more conservative group, is sort of centered around Cincinnati. And then you get churches of Christ, who were called antis, conservatives, mossbacks, a lot of uncomplimentary names and so forth. And the other group was called progressives or liberals or digressives or other uncomplimentary sorts of names as well. Yes. Sure.
First meeting I ever held was in Granbury.
All right. Yeah.
That was in 1971. And we were putting up a sign. Preacher there was Les Richardson. We were putting up a sign about the meeting. Fella walked around in front of the building, just went back and forth, finally stopped at a post and asked, "Are you the progs or the non-progs?"
Yeah. Progressive or not? Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so anyway, let me just say a word about missionary societies, because although the division is often said to be over instruments, missionary societies, I think, were as deeply involved, and there's a principle here. Sometimes people would say, well, we oppose the society because it put a lot of undue pressure on churches. Churches were pressured to support the society, just like churches were pressured later to support the college. I talked about that the other day. Or because it was a concentration of wealth. It put too much wealth in the hands of a few people to tell the churches what to do. Or it was an inefficient operation. Anytime you have an organization like that, some of the money that's donated to it goes to grease the wheels. And so if you're ever donating, even to an organization that does, food banks or whatever, you want to look at how much of what you're donating actually goes to produce product and how much of it goes to administration. That's an important thing. And people said the same thing about the Missionary Society, that it's inefficient or it's abusive. Well, okay, all of that may be true, but that's not really what makes a missionary society wrong, in my view anyway. Now, all of that's bad if that's true, but ask yourself this. If you got rid of all of the abuses and it wasn't promoting elitism and it didn't put pressure on churches, would that make it right? Would that make the missionary society okay if none of the first paragraph is true? No. What makes a missionary society wrong, in my view, biblically, is it's an inherently unscriptural cooperative of churches. It puts churches together in a hierarchy in a way that God never intended. And some of the early restorers saw this when they talked about autonomy of churches. Let's get out of the Baptist Association. Let's get out of the presbytery. Let's write its last will and testament. But people would say, if God does not specify the means, then we're free to do anything we please. And that's an argument that has been applied to society. So I'd love to talk more about that. Maybe another issue is when you have a division like this, what's more important? Is it more important to have what you're pushing for or to have the fellowship of your other brothers? Brother Moses said to me a while ago, he said, I don't know what his uncle was thinking, but he just wanted to have his silly piano. And it was more important to have the piano or to support the missionary society than to have or the college or whatever, than to have the fellowship of brothers who cannot, and sisters who cannot in good conscience support that. So again, love to talk more about this, but I've got to move on. Yes, sir.
I was thinking, early, we have an almost unlimited capacity to justify whatever we want to do.
Yeah.
All of us wrestle with that sometimes. And Alexander Campbell wrote so vehemently, so strongly against human societies and against any sort of organization like that, and then turned around and became the first president of the American Christian Missionary Society. And he was called down about that. How can you write against it for so long and now turn right around and do the very thing that you wrote against? He said, well, I didn't mean all societies, just the ones that are bad society. Well, see, what he's doing is justifying his own behavior, which we're all prone to do if we're not careful.
Yeah. Listen to Brother Evans here. He's preaching the truth. Absolutely. So translate some of these ideas into the 1950s division. Probably none of us went through that as an adult, but I can tell you from talking to people who did and reading a lot of what was written at the time, there was, for example, a lot of pressure to line up. One of the early things that happened, 1954, which is even before the first published debate. Now, there were a lot of debates that never got published, but the first published debate was the one I got dragged to as a 5-year-old in Indianapolis between Will Toddy and Charles Holt, the older, not the younger one that some of you may have known. By the way, Betty grew up in the congregation where Brother Holt was in Franklin, so for whatever that's worth. But the yellow tag of quarantine was hung out in a 1954 editorial in the Gospel Advocate. An elder in a Texas church, if I recall correctly, wrote to Brother Goodpasture, who was the editor, and said, "We need to put the yellow tag of quarantine on these antis." Now, again, most of you are probably too young to know what a yellow tag of quarantine is. But before wonder drugs, penicillin, sulfa, and all of these things that came along in the 1930s and 40s, largely as a result of World War II, communicable diseases were one of the main killers of people. If you got anthrax or smallpox, or think of any disease that we consider to be eradicated perhaps today, um, uh, local sheriff's office would come along and slap a yellow tag of quarantine on your door. And you were not allowed to leave. Nobody outside your family was allowed to come in, because if you did, or you went out into the public and went to the store, you're spreading a deadly disease that is going to kill other people. You might as well take a 6-shooter and go around and shoot people, was the idea. And so what the advocate is saying is, let's put a yellow tag of quarantine on these people. I don't know if you remember, back a few years ago, we had a big anthrax scare. And friends of mine who are first responders, both EMTs and law enforcement, told me that some of their training, one guy actually said, "You mean to tell me that if we encounter somebody who is violating their quarantine, maybe carrying anthrax, we need to shoot him?" And the trainer said, "Yeah, that's exactly right. Because otherwise, they're going to infect who knows how many other people." At least that was what I have been told by people that I think know what they're talking about. So we don't we haven't grown up in a generation that understood what it was like to be quarantined. And in addition to that sort of thing, this pressure to line up and support these institutions, like, for example, Florida College was nearly put out of business because they were the only college that said, "No, we will not take church contributions." And people on their board who said, "Yes, you will," put a lot of pressure on them, withholding contributions and so forth, and very nearly succeeded. The CEI store that still today is in Athens, Alabama, had an extension store in Abilene. And when the issues came along, because they were run by people who didn't believe that it was right to support the college, they were boycotted and actually were put out of business. Um, People said, you people will not help starving orphans. Churches were pressured just to put $10 a month into their budget to support a college so they wouldn't get labeled anti. I've had a number of people in institutional churches tell me that that's exactly what happened. If you read the ads for preachers in the papers, no anti need apply. The Advocate carried a whole train of confessions of people who would say, "I've left the antis and I'm available for meetings." Would you ever imagine that a preacher would get up in the pulpit and wave a fertilizer bag as a part of his lesson? But the idea was, and what was often said, "You antis, you would pay money to put fertilizer on the church lawn, but you won't spend a dime to help a starving orphan." Never mind that more orphans were being cared for by the families at the college, or by the staff of the Gospel Guardian, or Eugene Britnell up in Little Rock did a survey in the 1960s in which he sent out to about 50 churches and just said, the churches that were not supporting orphanages, said, "Tell me, how many orphans are being cared for in the families in your congregation?" And he compiled a list, documented in fact, that was larger than the whole population of all of the 50 orphanages that were being operated by Churches of Christ at that time. These are antis that supposedly don't believe in helping little orphans. but they're caring for them in their homes rather than warehousing them in some kind of a factory where you got 30 students and 2 parents or something, and all sorts of abuses arose out of that. Some of you, if you studied the history of orphanages, you know that state orphanages, states were getting out of that in the 1940s and 50s because of the abuses that went along in these institutional orphanages. At about the same time, churches of Christ were getting into it. They thought that was a great idea. Everybody else is saying, no, let's do that. So they adopted a foster home system, and that has its own bag of problems, to be sure. But certainly way better to put a child in a home that has parents and they can be raised as a family, what you might call in loco parentis was the phrase, rather than to put them in warehouses. So the church I preach for in Louisville started because of a lawsuit that was brought, because of fisticuffs could you imagine brethren getting so upset over issues they'd actually hit each other with a closed fist? Betty's dad was struck by an elder. Shameful behavior. And some of you may be shocked to hear me recount some of this, but that's what happens when you get into a division and people are bound and determined to have their way, and other people are saying, no, I don't think that's biblical, and I cannot go along with that. Now, things have not gotten better in some ways. One of the big issues, of course, was the Herald of Truth, television evangelism, which is extremely expensive, and no one church is generally able to put on a national television program. So the idea was, let's get all the little churches to send their contributions up the line to the Highland Church in Abilene, and we'll put on this national TV program because we got to have a Church of Christ program, because Bishop Sheen has his program for the Catholics, and who's the positive thinking guy? I can't think of his name anyway. Yeah, Norman Vincent Peale. Thank you. Just the words I was looking for, Royce. You got a better memory than I do, at least about those kind of things. All right, so this TV program, though, kind of changed the direction of preaching in Churches of Christ. This is from Richard Hughes's history. Churches of Christ found that they could not expect to compete effectively in the denominational free market of souls, where you're out in the public square trying to attract people to the truth in this case, unless they embraced the sort of peace of mind piety that had dominated the national religious landscape for more than a decade. In other words, you got to become more like Norman Vincent Peale. You got to be positive. You can't be negative. People are not going to listen to that kind of negativity, if you will. So, with increasing frequency, the Herald of Truth explained to national radio and TV audiences how to achieve spiritual growth and peace of mind, how to develop healthy family relationships, how to cope with anxiety and fear, the various stages along life's way. Now, all of that's good. I mean, I talk about those kind of things sometimes in my preaching, but if that's the only diet that you get, and you don't talk about other biblical issues, and you don't make it very clear that what the Lord's church is as opposed to these denominations out here, then for one thing, why would somebody want to be, if the Church of Christ just starts to look like the denominational world, why would you want to be a member of a Church of Christ, is the idea. And it goes deeper than that. Increasingly, leading preachers turn to the language, props, and forms of television shows in narrating sermons. Now, he's talking about what happened in the 1970s and 80s here. Popular television game show formats provide the form for the sermon content. Let that sit with you for a minute. Popular television game show formats provide the form for sermon content. Preachers become characters from popular television sitcoms along with featured replica props, again, to narrate ideas or create a dialogue with the congregation to convey the idea of the sermon. I think I've got an example locally of that here in a moment. A book called The Worldly Church was written by, these are people at Abilene at the time that were in institutional churches, but here's what they said. There was a time when Churches of Christ were widely known as a people of the book. All who knew us knew that we hungered above all for the Word of God. They knew that we immersed ourselves in its truths and sacrificed dearly to share the gospel with those who had never heard. These were our most fundamental commitments. We knew it, and others knew it. But as Willard Collins, who was president of David Lipscomb College in Nashville, said, reflecting on his own life, I don't think members of the church think the church is different from Protestantism. When I started preaching, which was back in the 1930s, he said members of the church believed Protestants needed to be saved. All the people in Baptist and Presbyterian, Methodist churches and so forth, we've lost a lot of that. It goes back to an understanding of the distinctiveness of the church. At an earlier time, they really felt the gospel was a lot better than Protestantism. When asked to compare the church and its members from the 1980s, when he was writing this, to the 1930s, and things have not improved in the succeeding decades. This is Willard Collins, former president of David Lipscomb, said, I don't think they see the glory of the church unencumbered by denominationalism as I did when I was growing up. In a lot of ways, this parallels what has happened in the wider evangelical world, which has its own conservative and institutional wings. I found this quotation interesting. This is a guy, a pretty liberal evangelical, describing what's happened in that, and it parallels what's going on in churches of Christ. The sense of embattlement with the world is rapidly evaporating among many evangelicals, a sense that we need to be separate from the world. We don't share the world's concerns. We don't have the world's values. We don't engage in the conduct of the world generally. And what he's saying is that sense of embattlement, of separateness from the world, is disappearing among a lot of evangelicals, especially evangelical elites among those who belong to the knowledge industry, the college professors, for example. In the last half century, they've enjoyed increasing success in the world of biblical and theological scholarship. They reacted against the separatism of their fundamentalists, their conservative forebears, who precisely in their separation from the world knew that they had a sure word of God for the world. And he goes on to say, by worldliness, now this is a denominational guy, but I think it's a pretty good definition of worldliness. I mean not merely the disregard of fundamentalist taboos against smoking, drinking, dancing, movie going, gambling, and the like, but more expansively, matters such as materialism, pleasure seeking, indiscriminate enjoyment of salacious and violent entertainment. So everything from pornography to the video games that you need to be aware of what your kids are playing if you're not, immodesty of dress, voyeurism, pornography, if you will, sexual laxity, and divorce. As these things have crept into churches, both in the denominational world and among churches of Christ, bad things have happened. So he goes on to say, well, let me just, this is the last I've got of that, and I want to do something else. With the consequent whetting of the appetite for academic and political and broadly cultural power, this idea that's out there in the world that we can kind of become like the world in order to win the world, and then that gives us political power and we can sort of merge our religion and politics, he says, has become the dangers of accommodation, of becoming like the world, of dulling the sharp edges of the gospel, of blurring the distinction between believers in the world, of softening or not issuing at all the warning that God's wrath abides on unbelievers, John 3:36. That's only 20 verses after John 3:16. And it warns us that the wrath of God abides on unbelievers. In short, of only whispering the word instead of shouting him, speaking boldly as the world himself did. Put that in the context of churches of Christ. In 1986, an expression of concern, a document was signed by 300 and some odd preachers, mostly in institutional churches, who believed and went along with things like a fellowship hall or maybe the Herald of Truth at the beginning or something, but then began to be disturbed about how far those things were going. So here's what they said about it. We are deeply disturbed over the liberalism that is so evident in the brotherhood today. Now, this is 40 years ago. By liberalism, we mean the following items. First, there's a drifting from the Bible-centered, definitive, distinctive doctrine that once characterized our preaching, that we knew and everybody else knew. Many of our people, including preachers and elders, no longer know the difference between true Christianity and the corrupted forms of it that are so prevalent among us. Item number 2, there is a concerted effort on the part of some brethren to restructure the organization and the work and the worship of the church along sectarian lines. No anti could have said this better, and these guys are not antis. A spirit of doctrinal compromise and fellowshipping of those in blatant religious error has permeated our ranks. Item D, the world has made alarming inroads into the church. Instead of the church influencing the world for righteousness, the world has adversely affected many brethren in matters of morality and conduct of life. Brother Evans was telling me yesterday, showed me this book that he's done on our stuff. And the love of stuff and the love of things and the love of money is eating the heart out of the church of the Lord Jesus Christ. The typical emphasis of the denominational world on recreation, entertainment, solving the social ills of society has been incorporated into the program of many congregations, supplanting what the God-given work of the congregation is, which is meeting the spiritual needs of those both within and without the body of Christ. Too many churches of Christ, are saying, have become sidetracked into feeding people and doing social things and providing entertainments and family life centers and so forth, rather than preaching the gospel that can save souls. I'll give you one other thing. Abe Mallerby, who now deceased, was a native South African, converted, I think, under Elder Eccles' preaching, came to Abilene, did a degree there, and then went to Harvard for his PhD. Taught at Abilene for a while, but he became Buckingham Professor of New Testament Interpretation at Yale University. When he retired, 2 of the 6 candidates for this chair and the one who's finally selected were his graduate students who had been at Abilene. So this is a guy who knows what he's talking about and has had a front row seat to see what's happening both in academia and in churches of Christ. When he was interviewed this is 2002, so 23 years ago, a generation ago. What are some of your concerns for our fellowship, for churches of Christ? My major concern is our cozying up to those evangelicals who put a premium on feeling at the expense of reason. Now, there's nothing wrong with feeling. Emotion is a powerful driver, and we ought to be emotional about the sacrifice of Christ and about the cost of the gospel and so forth, but not at the expense of reason, of what the scripture says. The two ought to coexist, and he's saying we've gotten all out of balance with regard to that. Evangelical priorities and language have come to suffuse, to occupy much of the preaching in our fellowship, combined with a style of preaching common in all churches these days, which is narratival and anecdotal. In other words, tell me a story. Let me move the audience by telling you about my mother's deathbed, or about my dog who died, or about whatever I think might elicit an emotional response. It's narratival, it tells a story, anecdotal rather than expository. In other words, opening the Bible and say, let's find out what this text says. It results in sermons that are as theologically thin gruel as are many of the so-called praise songs we sing. I'll pause there to say, I've been credited as the guy who started the phrase, the 7-Eleven hymns. You've heard of 7-Eleven hymns, 7 words, sing them 11 times. A lot of the praise. I wish I could claim originality. I actually borrowed that from the Methodist college that I went to school right after I left FC there. So I give credit. I wish it was original with me, but that's what he's talking about. Theologically thin gruel. Where did I go with that? All right. It seems that the goal of many services is to achieve an emotional response without imparting biblical knowledge. And that is certainly true more and more of churches of Christ, even supposedly sound churches, non-institutional churches. I'm hearing a lot of younger preachers, not Tyler, thank goodness. There are some young preachers that are doing, younger than me anyway, doing great work, but I just have to, scratch my head sometimes when I read what some young guys are saying, because it just sounds like the denominational stuff that I knew when I was going through some of these denominational colleges. So, what actually happened? Well, post-World War II, when you're coming out of a major war like that, you get a new generation of leadership. You get it's not maybe, it's kind of symbolic that in 1940 and 41, within about a 15-month period, a lot of these old preachers that were up in their 80s, Daniel Sommer, Joe Warlick, who was this Dallas guy who had a lot of the debates with Ben Bogard, F.B. Shrigley, who was an editor of The Advocate, J.D. Tant, Texas preacher, they all died in their 80s about 15 months apart. And it sort of represented a change of generation. You get new editors and so forth, and a new institutional boom, if you will. After World War II, the GI Bill one of the most far-reaching pieces of legislation of the 20th century, maybe second only to Social Security. All these men who came back from the war were able to use their GI benefits to go to college. Colleges were given funds, so you get this explosion of people going to college. Before World War II, maybe about 10% of the population went to college. After World War II, but today, probably most of the population goes at least a year or two to college, maybe finishes a bachelor's degree. And all of these colleges that are springing up and making transitions from what might have been once a normal school, a teacher's college, now they are expanding and becoming a university. Well, what does it take to do that? It takes buckets of money, among other things. And so if you're a college like a small Church of Christ school, man, you need money. And you get some of it through the GI Bill. But what's an obvious source of money for a church college? Maybe obvious to some people. Yeah, ask the churches to support it. Start begging the churches for donations. And so you get all of this institutional growth of sponsoring churches and orphanages. There were about 5 orphanages before World War II. Now, and many people thought it wasn't a good idea for churches to support them. In fact, they were divided among themselves. The big controversy was, should you have an orphanage under a church that's overseen by elders? Or some people thought that was wrong. The church elders have no business overseeing a home or a farm, and usually they're supported by farming industries. That's not the work of the church. So some people said, let's put it under a board, under a board of people from all these different churches, and then we'll send money to this thing that's overseen by a board. And other people said, well, no, there's no biblical authority for the church supporting something that's an institution like that. But you get this explosion of orphanages, more than 50, almost 60 orphanages after World War II. And all of them with their hand out, begging for money and making arguments like, if you don't support our orphanage, then you don't believe in helping these poor little starving orphans, and so forth and so on. And then somebody came along and said, well, if we can support the orphanage, then we ought to be able to support the college. So N.B. Hardeman in 1947, and then wrote an article in which he said, the college and the orphanage stand or fall together. The same scriptures that will authorize one will authorize the other. Anybody heard that argument? Some of you are nodding like you've heard that before. I think that's true. I think that there are no scriptures that would support one, and therefore none that would support the other. But to be consistent, I think you'd have to say, if you can biblically support one, why not the other? Well, the difference in an orphanage and a college is that orphans have this really warm, fuzzy emotional appeal. I mean, how could you not have the milk of human kindness to support an orphanage? Whereas a college is sort of, elite and intellectual and, pointy-headed intellectuals. And, do we really want the church? It just doesn't have the same kind of emotional appeal, if you will. In one of the debates that I have here, this is Roman numeral, where are we, 19, the Willis-Inman debate, somebody the last night of the debate laid up on the podium where Cecil, who was opposing church support of colleges and orphanages, laid a little picture of a little Annie, or Orphan Annie kind of a girl with a little doll, and she was kind of bedraggled and a tear coming down one cheek. And somebody asked Cecil, how do you answer an argument like that? How do you answer an emotional appeal like that? And Cecil, who always had a kind of a nose for the jugular, said, color her black. We talked about some racial issues yesterday. In other words, if this was an African American child, of which there were none, I mean 0, in any Church of Christ orphanage up until at least the 1970s. Many of the orphanages, in fact, Potter orphanages, I know for a fact in Bowling Green, had it written into their articles of incorporation, no African American children allowed. And in fact, most of them weren't even truly orphanages. Some of them had clauses that say, we will not take a child under 2 years old or under 3 years old. And so, yeah, there was that aspect of it as well. But there was an emotional appeal about supporting an orphanage that was lacking in nearly anything else. So I'm kind of back to the yellow tag of quarantine. I've been involved in some of the efforts to keep this discussion going. I helped organize a few meetings, one of them in Dallas, actually, in 1990, where we had hundreds of people come together, preachers, elders, and Christians, to discuss these issues. I think this conversation needs to be kept alive.
Steve is underselling this just a little bit, probably out of not wanting to pump himself up, and so
Well,
you have done a lot to try to foster these conversations, and these have not been small meetings.
yeah.
These have been well-attended meetings of brethren of all stripes and colors and ideas who have come together and tried to reason.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Although I said after the Dallas meeting in 1990, partly because I was starting to go overseas and do a lot of overseas work at the time, and I said, I'm going to back out of organizing these meetings, because if it's just me pushing it, then that's not worth much. And I said, if anybody else in the audience of several hundred preachers wants to take this over and organize it, be my guest. And nobody seemed to want to do that. So I think you're correct. I think it's important, and I'm willing to spend some time doing that. But it's not the sole focus of what I want to spend my time doing. But yeah, I think it is important. So we've got just a few minutes. I want to talk about the racial aspect of things, because I was asked to do that, and I need to get into a different presentation. Anybody have any questions while I'm trying to find my program here? You have a handout sheet that has a lot of this, but sometimes in the handout sheet, I will refer, I say, look at the PowerPoint. So I think uh, Tyler's going to get a copy of this if he hadn't already. I talked about the slave balcony. So the churches arose in a time when there was open segregation, when slaves were kept separate for the most part. Although people like Stone and Campbell, I make a note on here, Campbell, they were both involved in the colonization movement, which was not successful. Campbell, after educating his slaves, manumitted them. Stone moves to Illinois, as I showed you yesterday, in order to be able to do that. His house still stands there. But they all partook of this kind of racial attitude. I don't want to portray them as progressives or liberals by today's standards, certainly. Campbell said, this is 1845, in a series of articles, Our Position to Slavery. I mean, everybody is talking about this. This is front and center on the national agenda. And if you think today's politics are nasty, you ought to go back and read some of the pre-Civil War, or even some that occurred after Jefferson's election in 1800. Jefferson had fathered some slaves had fathered children by one of his slaves. That's been proven, although many people denied it, but DNA doesn't lie. And a lot of books been written about that. But the political rhetoric was just absolutely down in the gutter. Maybe worse than, maybe not worse than today's, but certainly as bad. Well, here's what Campbell says. Much as I may sympathize with a black man, and he did, I love the white man more. As a political economist, a philanthropist, and he was both of those, I have many reasons for preferring the prospects and conditions of the free to the slave states. Better to have freedom than to have slavery. But especially as a Christian, I sympathize much more with the owners of slaves, their heirs and successors, than the slaves which they possess and bequeath, which they own as property and bequeath. So you have to put this in its context. And everybody agreed. I mean, not everybody, but a lot of this was sort of the national milieu. So I'm giving it to you with the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now there were other people who were more radical than Campbell. I mean, the Cane Ridge Church was an abolitionist church. I mean, they were not only in favor of freeing slaves, abolishing slavery, but making them fully incorporated into American society. Pardee Butler, who was an abolitionist in Bleeding, Kansas before the war, and was rafted down the Missouri River. They didn't tar and feather him, I don't think, but put him on a raft, and then they did a lot of cartoons about him. He's calling on Horace Greeley, who was another well-known newspaper editor. He says, "To the rescue, I have an N-word." And so that gives you a sense maybe of the times. Ovid Butler, no relation to Pardee, who was an abolitionist attorney in Indianapolis and a newspaper publisher, founded what's now Butler University, named after him. as an anti-slavery alternative to Campbell's Bethany College. They could read what Campbell said about slaves and slavery. Even though Campbell freed his slaves, he has these racial attitudes behind him. James Shannon, on the other hand, was an ardent pro-slavery advocate. This guy's a gospel preacher. Second president of the University of Missouri. But before that, he was president of Bacone College in Harrodsburg, Kentucky, which was a school that grew up as a kind of a rival school to Bethany. And he had a debate with John C. Young, who was president at Center College at the time, nearby Danville, who was an anti-slavery advocate. Well, I'm going to skip through some things. David Lipscomb came along. This is after the Civil War. And this is in the South now. Lipscomb says, "We believe it is sinful to have two congregations in the same community for persons of separate and distinct races. God saves the Negro equally with the white man when he believes in Christ and puts him on by being buried with him in baptism." Negro was a common way that they referred to it. Lipscomb, let's see here. "For our part, we would much prefer membership with an humble and despised band of ignorant Negroes than with a congregation of the aristocratic and refined whites in the land, cherishing such a spirit of defiance of God and his law and all the principles of his holy religion." So there's still some paternalistic attitude going on here, but very interesting comment. Daniel Sommer, who I mentioned earlier, Lipscomb's talking about it. Sommer's actually doing it. Although Sommer's in the North, where you don't have legal segregation, sometimes de facto segregation, but nothing by law like you would in the South. If Lipscomb tried to do this, they probably would have tarred and feathered him. But this is, he's been doing this for 20 years, but this is a picture of his Bible reading students in Indianapolis, 1894. This is 2 years before Plessy v. Ferguson that I talk about in the outline. You can see W.S. Clark, African American, in the upper right corner there. Now it intrigues me as to why is he in the corner. I don't know, and there's no way to tell. Is he in the corner because somebody said go stand in the corner? Why isn't he on the front row? I don't know. Or maybe if nobody said that, maybe he just was socialized to think this is his place. I don't know. But the picture, I think, tells a story in a lot of different ways. At least nobody's standing in the door saying you can't come in here. You're welcome to come to the Bible study, and we would like you to be in the picture that records it. So my point is, there's a whole range of mixed range of emotions and statements about this kind of thing. J.D. Tant, Texas preacher, goes up to Kansas to preach, that had been bleeding Kansas 30 years, 40 years before that. In 1898, he says, "Negro equality runs high here. Negroes ride in the same coach, go to the same school, eat the same table with white people, and sometimes sleep in the beds of their white neighbors, all of which I am glad to say is not tolerated in heathen Texas." Now, if you look at the date on this, this is 2 years after the United States Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson makes separate but equal facilities legal separation the law of the land. Homer Plessy was an African American who lived in New Orleans and sued because of rail car conditions, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can have a separate car for blacks and a separate car for whites, and never the twain shall meet, and that should extend to separate schools, separate restrooms, separate water fountains. I remember as a kid making my first trip into the South. I had relatives who went to Florida Christian College at the time. This would have been about 1956. And driving through Georgia, seeing colored and white watered fountains, labeled colored and white. Colored and white waiting rooms in the bus stations. And as a kid who'd been raised where we didn't do that, I was like, what in the world is going on with that? And of course, in 1954, just shortly before that, the Supreme Court reversed in the Brown versus Board of Education ruling any kind of legal segregation. But patterns die hard, and so segregation continued for a long time. So I just put this together for our young people. And there are some other things that are not very pretty here, but we're already over time. So I'll leave you with the PowerPoint, and you can read all of the other stuff if you want to. I will make this last point. that one of the main things that caused the desegregation of Christian colleges, which happened in the 1960s, was primarily that the government, not just in Brown versus Board of Education in '54, but before that, one of the major institutions in our culture, Major League Baseball, is desegregated. The whole Jackie Robinson affair that begins in 1947, and then you get Roy Campanella and a lot of other African American players who put to the lie any idea that African Americans simply can't play baseball with the white boys. They're just not good enough. So you end the Negro Leagues, and then President Truman desegregates the military in 1947 or 8. And the military, probably even today, is one of the institutions that more than others often promotes on the basis of merit rather than other consideration. I know that's not always true, but the idea is people ought to be judged on their merits and on their accomplishments and whether they can do the job or not, and not what the color of their skin is and so forth. So those governmental social things are what draw. I mean, why weren't churches taking the lead and saying this is wrong? This is not biblical. So you get the culture generally kind of driving what's happening here. I'll just make that observation for whatever it's worth. There are 4 or 5 recent works that I put as a bibliography at the bottom if you want more information. If you don't, I did that because I was asked to do it. So there you have it.
To be fair, there were some churches that were practicing
Yes.
integration, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I grew up in a church, and in what had been the old summer church that we got when we got kicked out of the institutional church that we went to. It was integrated as long as I can remember. Now, there was only a minority of families that were not white, but these are a lot of blue-collar Democrats, members of the church who voted Democrat because, I mean, even big discussion in the 1960 election is can a Christian vote for a Catholic Democrat like John F. Kennedy? Man, some of you maybe have had the same kind of experience, I don't know, and a lot of the people in our congregation said, yeah, we got no problem voting for a Democrat. They've been voting Democrat all their life. But yeah, it was integrated, and there were churches like that, maybe in other places, I don't know. But it is interesting that it wasn't widely done. I can tell you when Betty and I moved to Atlanta in 1971, second place I preached after preaching in Indiana. We went to a congregation that was in a neighborhood that was transitioning from white to black, mostly upper middle class, African American lawyers and doctors and school administrators and so forth. Hank Aaron had a house 3 blocks from the church building. And I was able to have a lot of Bible studies there. Sometimes I looked like a cue ball. I was the only white boy in the room. And a lot of times I get doors slammed in my face with somebody say, "What do you want with me, Whitey?" But we began to have African American preachers come in and hold meetings to try to reach out to the community there. And I kind of became known. This is my claim to fame, Tyler. Before I started all the meetings you referred to, I got to know a lot of the African American preachers. And I would go down to Simpson Street and other traditionally African American congregations, and there was and this is only 3 years after the King assassination. Now, this is 1971. I mean, Lester Maddox is still the lieutenant governor of Georgia, handing out axe handles for down at his Pickwick restaurant for people to go whale on the black kids. And some of the black preachers appreciated anybody in the white community kind of paying attention to them. So I formed a lot of friendships among some of the older African American preachers. Brother Evans was asking me about Lloyd Nash here in San Antonio, but there were other people like him, and there was both a resistance to integration, but there were some churches that were doing it. You're absolutely correct. So, any other questions or comments or anything you disagree with? I'd be glad to talk about anything you want.
Just to make a comment about the battle during the 50s. My dad was the speaker on the Church of Christ Salute You radio program in Fresno.
All right.
And I was born in 48. He was in Hanford.
Yeah,
California.
you're older than me, aren't you?
2 months. Yeah, 3 something like
Just had to make the point.
Yeah. But so he born in 49. He was already preaching in, but before my dad died in 1959, my mother told the story of a battle at the church, Southside Church in Midland.
Yeah.
And she heard my older brother, who will be 81 in just a couple of weeks, rummaging around in their bedroom closet. She said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm going to get the shotgun." And she said, "What in the world do you want with a shotgun?" She said, "I'm going to go kill that man who had attacked my dad because of the institution." As I said, my older brother will be 81 in a couple of weeks. Never obeyed the gospel, and he will not countenance a discussion at all on the subject. So he'll lose his soul, I'm convinced, because of the way brethren treated one another in the 1950s.
Yeah. The day of judgment is not going to be pretty for many of us. So, all right. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much. I'll be happy to stay as long as anybody wants to talk about any of this, but I did the best I could in 3 days. Okay.